Hey everybody, Dr. O here, and in this video we're going to be going over the neurotransmitters and receptors found in the autonomic nervous system as well as the somatic nervous system. So let's get started. We're going to start by talking about the autonomic nervous system, and you might remember that the autonomic nervous system has two divisions. It has the parasympathetic division and it has the sympathetic division. And within these two divisions, you might remember that this is a two-neuron system, at least for the most part. So we're going to have to take into consideration our preganglionic neuron and what it's doing, our postganglionic neuron and what it's doing, and then we have a third player that we have to be mindful of, which is going to be the target cell. So when we think about the neurotransmitters that are being released and the receptors that are interacting with those neurotransmitters, our areas of interest are going to be right here and right there. So let's start off by looking at the preganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic division. What neurotransmitter does it release? Well, this always releases acetylcholine. And then the postganglionic neuron is always going to have a nicotinic receptor that will interact with that acetylcholine. Now, what about our second side of interest? Well, here the postganglionic neuron will be releasing acetylcholine too. But out in the body, the receptors for this acetylcholine, the receptors found on our target cell, this is going to be a muscarinic receptor. So in the parasympathetic division, our preganglionic neuron always releases acetylcholine, and our postganglionic neuron always has a nicotinic receptor that's going to interact with that. And our postganglionic neuron is always going to release acetylcholine, and the target out in the body is always going to have a muscarinic receptor that's going to interact with that acetylcholine. In the sympathetic division, this is the part of the autonomic nervous system where we tend to think in terms of fight or flight. So we're going to look at that particular scenario right now. So here is our preganglionic neuron, and it's going to be releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Our postganglionic neuron will have nicotinic receptors that are going to interact with that acetylcholine. But now we need to ask, what does this postganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system release as far as a neurotransmitter? Well, this neuron is releasing norepinephrine. This is one of the hormones that we tend to associate with fight or flight. And most body cells are going to have adrenergic receptors that are capable of engaging with this norepinephrine. And so this is the pathway that we're typically seeing with most body cells that are capable of interacting with the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. But there are some special cases, some structures that respond differently. So let's take a look at those next. In this other scenario in the sympathetic nervous division, we're going to be targeting specific structures in the body. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So here we're going to have our preganglionic neuron, and it's going to be releasing acetylcholine. Our postganglionic neuron is going to have nicotinic receptors that are going to engage that acetylcholine. But what sort of neurotransmitter is this postganglionic neuron going to release? Well, it's going to be releasing acetylcholine too. And the targets for this in the sympathetic division are going to be sweat glands and skeletal muscle blood vessels. These are the blood vessels that are going to allow the skeletal muscle to be filled with blood so that when we're in sympathetic state, we can run from the bear or we can stand and fight the bear. And the sort of receptors that we're going to see on these target cells is going to be a muscarinic receptor. So in the sympathetic nervous system, we've got our preganglionic neurons both releasing acetylcholine. Our postganglionic neurons both have nicotinic receptors interacting with that acetylcholine. But one postganglionic neuron is going to be releasing norepinephrine while the other one is releasing acetylcholine. Out in the body, if a cell has an adrenergic receptor on it, it can engage with the neurotransmitter. But if you are a sweat gland or a skeletal muscle cell, then you're going to be stimulated with your muscarinic receptor by the acetylcholine that gets released by this second scenario in the sympathetic division. Now, I still have a little more space in my sympathetic square because I have one more scenario to cover. Now, this last scenario does not involve a two-neuron system. This one involves the neuron that is leaving the central nervous system and engaging the adrenal medulla. So then we have to ask ourselves, what sort of neurotransmitter is this neuron releasing? Well, it's releasing acetylcholine. And the type of receptor that we see in the adrenal medulla, it is a nicotinic. And that pretty much tells us a story about what's happening with the autonomic nervous system and the sorts of neurotransmitters and receptors that we have being engaged. Now, before we leave this screen, I want to point out some patterns. The first pattern is that if you look at the first neuron, even if there's only one neuron, as in the case of the adrenal medulla, the first neuron in a two-neuron series, or in the case of the adrenal medulla, always releases acetylcholine. So the preganglionic neuron always releases acetylcholine. And even that first neuron in the relationship with the adrenal medulla also releases acetylcholine. The other pattern that you might notice is that the postganglionic neuron receptor type is always nicotinic. And the last thing I'll point out is that only adrenergic receptors are going to engage norepinephrine. Other than that, you're going to have to remember the muscarinics and the nicotinics on the target cell. So most of the variation that we're going to see is right along this target cell. I hope that helps. Now, at this point, I'd like to address the somatic system. And in this case, we do not have a two-neuron system. We just have a long neuron that is leaving the central nervous system, and it's going to interact with a target cell. And it's going to release acetylcholine, and our target cell is going to have a nicotinic receptor. And our target cells in the somatic system are going to be mostly skeletal muscle. So that's how we can think of that. And with that, we are done. Thanks for watching. See you next time.